A car that can't start. Crew members with their hands flat against black and gold sheet metal, leaning their full weight into it, pushing it into a frame it's too broken to enter on its own power. That's the last surviving Trans Am from Smokey and the Bandit in its final working hours. Not roaring across a bridge, not sliding sideways through a Georgia back road, being shoved. Everyone assumes Pontiac knew exactly what they had, that somewhere in a boardroom in Michigan, an executive looked at the black and gold special edition and said, "This is the one. Put it in the movie. Watch the money come in." That's not what happened. What actually happened is a company that had nearly killed this car a few years earlier handed over 4 dressed-up test units to a stuntman making his first movie, and then more or less forgot about it until the phones started ringing. This is the story of how a low-budget film accidentally did what Pontiac's own marketing department couldn't, and how badly Pontiac underestimated the thing sitting in its own showroom. To understand what happened in 1977, you have to understand how close the Trans Am came to not existing at all. By the early 1970s, the American performance car was under siege. Insurance companies were raising premiums on anything with a big engine. Emissions regulations were tightening year over year, gutting horsepower ratings across the entire industry. The oil crisis of 1973 hit right as manufacturers were already scrambling to meet new federal standards, and buyers who wanted big engines suddenly couldn't afford to feed them. Muscle cars died fast in that environment. The GTO, Pontiac's own creation, the car that arguably started the whole muscle car era, was gone by 1974. The Plymouth Cuda was gone. The Ford Mustang, once a genuine performance machine, had been reduced to a compact economy car wearing a performance badge. The Trans Am survived, but surviving and thriving are different things. Total sales for the entire second-generation Trans Am's first 5 years on the market, 1970 through 1974 combined, came to 21,625 units, not per year, total. Across 5 model years, Pontiac sold fewer Trans Ams than it would sell in a single year just a few seasons later. This is the part that gets lost in the retelling. The Trans Am wasn't dead going into 1977. It had actually started climbing. 1975 brought a jump to 27,274 units, and 1976 pushed that further to somewhere around 46,700. Pontiac had a car that was recovering, slowly, from a near-death experience earlier in the decade. Recovering is not the same as arriving. Nobody inside Pontiac was describing 1976 as the year everything changed. It was a solid year, a good year even, given where the car had been. But if you'd told a Pontiac executive in early 1976 that this car, this specific model, in this specific configuration, was about to become one of the defining automotive images of the entire decade, they would have had no reason to believe you. There was no data yet. There was no signal. There was just a car that had clawed its way back from the brink and was doing fine. That's the before. A survivor, not yet a legend. Nobody betting on transformation. The production that would change all of that almost didn't get the car it needed. Hal Needham was not, in 1976, a known quantity as a director. He'd spent his career as a stuntman, one of the most respected in the business, with a reputation for doing things to his own body that most people wouldn't do to a car. But Smokey and the Bandit was his first time in the director's chair, financed on a budget that, by the standards of a studio picture, was thin, something in the neighborhood of $4 million. For comparison, that same summer, a science fiction film called Star Wars was spending many multiples of that and would go on to become the highest-grossing film of the year. Smokey and the Bandit would end up finishing second at the box office, behind Star Wars, but not by the margin you'd expect from a movie this modestly built. None of that was known yet when Needham needed cars. According to accounts from those close to the production, Needham had asked Pontiac for 6 Trans Ams. He got 4. One account puts the number even lower in terms of what actually made it to set intact, but the commonly cited figure, corroborated across multiple retrospectives, is 4. 3 built out for stunt work and camera-mounted driving sequences, and 1 held back purely for promotional appearances, press photos, the kind of static duty that doesn't require a car to survive a chase scene. Here's the detail that gets missed almost every time this story gets told. The actual 1977 Trans Am didn't exist yet when filming started. Principal photography began in the late summer of 1976, months before Pontiac's 1977 models would roll off any assembly line. So what Needham actually received were 1976 Trans Ams, modified to wear the new for 1977 front end. The switch from round dual headlights to the quad rectangular units that would come to define the Bandit look. Under the hood and in the chassis, these were leftover 1976 cars. On the surface, dressed to preview a model that public hadn't seen yet. This was functionally a promotional bet, the kind car manufacturers still make today, loaning vehicles to productions in hopes of exposure. Pontiac wasn't writing a check, they were handing over hardware they already had sitting around, betting nothing more than inventory and a little goodwill on a movie directed by a man who'd never directed anything. What Needham did with those cars tells you everything about how this production actually worked. The 3 stunt cars were reinforced, suspensions stiffened, transmissions beefed up, and structural work done to survive jumps, high-speed chases, and the kind of driving no showroom car was built to withstand. And they were driven hard. Reports vary slightly on the exact toll, but the consistent thread across every retrospective is the same. By the time filming wrapped, all 3 stunt cars had been effectively destroyed. One of the film's signature sequences, a jump over a broken bridge, required the car to be fitted with a rocket booster just to clear the gap, and the landing finished with the jump started. That left the 4th car, the promotional unit, the one that was never supposed to take a hit. By the final days of production, that car reportedly couldn't start on its own power anymore, worn down not by a single dramatic stunt, but by the accumulated wear of standing in for whatever the other 3 couldn't handle. Crew members pushed it into position for the last shots that needed it, not driven onto set, pushed. Every one of the 4 cars Pontiac supplied for this movie was gone by the time the cameras stopped rolling. Some reports indicate the wrecked stunt cars were later scrapped for parts to keep the others running during filming. Other accounts describe the studio destroying the vehicles afterward for liability reasons. The details of exactly what happened to each individual car in the weeks after wrap are murkier than most retellings admit, and claims about any of these 4 specific cars surviving in complete, unaltered form should be treated as unverified, reported in places but without documentation that would move them past that tier. What's not in question is this. Pontiac handed over aging inventory, dressed up to look like a car that didn't exist yet, to a first-time director with a budget a fraction of the summer's biggest release. And then all 4 of those cars were consumed, making a movie nobody at Pontiac had reason to believe would matter. Smokey and the Bandit opened on May 27, 1977, 2 days after Star Wars. On paper, that's a terrible date to release anything. In practice, the film found an audience Star Wars wasn't chasing, and it found it fast. By the end of its run, it had pulled in something in the neighborhood of $127 million domestically, finishing as the 2nd highest-grossing film of the year. A genuinely startling result for a movie built on this budget, with this little industry confidence behind it going in. And almost immediately, the car became inseparable from the film's identity. Dealerships reported customers walking in asking specifically for the Bandit car. Not the Trans Am, not the Firebird, but a request tied directly to a character on a movie screen. That's not typical dealership behavior. People don't usually walk onto a lot asking for a car by its fictional driver's nickname. It happened here, and it happened quickly enough that Pontiac's own people took notice of the shift almost in real time. Hal Needham himself would later put it plainly. Sales just soared after the film's release. That's a director's own account of watching a car he'd nearly destroyed on set become the thing everyone wanted to own. Here's where the story stops being anecdotal and becomes something you can actually measure. In 1976, the year before the film released, Pontiac sold somewhere around 46,700 Trans Ams. Sources differ slightly on the exact figure, landing either at 46,701 or 46,704, depending on which historical sales record you're pulling from. That gap is trivial, but worth naming, because the number that comes next is not trivial at all. In 1977, the year the film hit theaters, Trans Am sales jumped to somewhere between 68,744 and 68,745 units, again depending on the source. Call it a 50% increase in a single year for a car whose specifications, price, and dealer network hadn't fundamentally changed. The car Pontiac sold in 1977 was, mechanically, an evolution of the car they'd been selling right along. What changed wasn't the product. What changed was what the public believed the product meant. It didn't stop there. 1978 brought sales to roughly 93,341 units. Pontiac picked up an additional 25,000 sales that year alone, on top of an already record-setting 1977. And 1979 pushed the number past six figures entirely to 117,108 units, a figure that stands, by a wide margin, as the highest annual sales total the Trans Am would ever see across its entire production run. Lay those numbers next to each other, and the shape is unmistakable. Roughly 46,700, then 68,744, then 93,331, then 117,108. A near tripling in 3 years for a model line that had spent the first half of the decade fighting just to stay alive. The causal claim here is about as strong as these claims get in automotive history. Multiple independent retrospectives, including trade publications and the manufacturer's own contemporaneous statements through people like Needham, point to the same driver. But precision matters, and honesty about that precision matters more. Nobody ran a controlled study isolating the film's exact contribution from broader market recovery, rising muscle car nostalgia, or general economic conditions in the late 70s. What can be said with confidence is that the timing lines up too cleanly to be coincidence, that people inside the industry at the time were already crediting the film specifically, not the broader market, and that the shift arrived abruptly rather than gradually, in exactly the window you'd expect if a single cultural event were the trigger. This is the part of the story that should actually be startling, and usually isn't, because we've all seen the black and gold paint job so many times that it feels inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. It was 4 beat-up promotional cars, a first-time director, and a movie that beat every reasonable expectation anyone had for it, and the byproduct of all that was a sales chart that looks like a cliff. None of this stayed in the past. The '77 Trans Am, specifically the special edition package, the one with the black and gold paint, the T-tops, and the big hood graphic, is one of the most actively collected American cars of the 1970s, and the premium attached to it is directly traceable to this exact story. Real, numbers-matching 1977 Special Edition Trans Ams in good condition routinely sell well into 5 figures, and the rarest, most well-documented examples, particularly any car with a legitimate, verifiable connection to production or promotion, have crossed into 6-figure territory at major auction houses. That premium isn't about horsepower. The TA 6.6 package under the hood put out roughly 200 horsepower, respectable for 1977, but nowhere near what serious muscle car buyers were chasing a decade earlier. The premium is about the story. Buyers are paying for the black and gold, the hood bird, the association with a film that's been in constant cultural rotation for nearly 50 years. That creates a real risk for anyone getting into this market without doing their homework. A huge share of the Bandit-style Trans Ams on the market today are tribute builds. Cars converted to look the part, sometimes very well, without any of the underlying provenance the price is implicitly trading on. If you're shopping this car specifically because of what you just read, the first thing worth learning is how to tell a genuine numbers-matching Y82 Special Edition Trans Am from a well-executed clone. Engine codes, VIN decoding, documentation trail, the kind of due diligence that separates a car worth the premium from a car wearing a costume. For anyone building or restoring rather than buying, this is also one of the best supported vehicles in the entire classic muscle car space. Reproduction parts, decals, and trim are widely available specifically because demand for this exact car has stayed high for decades, which cuts both ways. It makes restoration achievable. It also means you're competing with a lot of other people chasing the same car for the same reasons at the same time. Companies spend enormous amounts of money trying to manufacture exactly this kind of moment, a product that becomes inseparable from a cultural touchstone, an association strong enough to triple sales and hold value for half a century. Pontiac didn't manufacture it. They handed over 4 worn-out promotional cars to a stuntman with no directing experience and a budget nobody was excited about, and then watched from the sidelines while the rest of the story wrote itself. The last of those 4 cars couldn't even start on its own by the time the camera stopped. It had to be pushed into its final scene. And somewhere in that image, a broken car being shoved into frame, about to help sell tens of thousands of its own kind the following year, is the whole story of how little control anyone actually had over what this car was about to become.